What am I? What are we, anyways? What am I? What are we, anyways? Hi there. Oh, there's a fair amount of you around today. Oh, I know. It must be the techies wanted to come to hear this one. It's a good one, I think. It's interesting. A revolution paves the way. A revolution paves the way. We've been exploring some of the deep, crumbly foundations of human being in the world and trying to get under a few of the myriad assumptions that have Legoed together and subsequently propped up the foundations of Western thought and lately become assumed realities. But something remarkable, and until very recently, not even on the horizon of cultural and scientific comprehension has appeared, as if from nowhere. And it relates not only to philosophy and the underneath of ratiocination thinking, but to the very nature of the brain and almost all the recent models of how the brain mediates the world. A new vision abandons the Turing, Van Neumann, Shannon computational model of knowledge and the brain. This dominant meander of intellectual endeavor isn't wrong, but rather misplaced, applying to a level of abstraction that is very useful, but completely off the mark when applied to the deepest level of lived in the world human functioning, and even more askew when applied to brain tissue and brain functioning. I'll call this model, as you know, Turing and Van Neumann and Claude Shannon were three of the geniuses who Legoed together a swath of the math and code that got computers thinking. I'll call this model of computing the classical model, which has been not only predominant over the last 50 years, more than 100 years of theoreticals, starting way back with Babbage and Ada Lovelace, but really the only game in town as computer hardware grew more and more powerful, and our world environment mental echo niche spawned a machine matrix that has engulfed us. In its simplest application, the classical model attempts to map or model the world, real life events, patterns, changes, by mathematical patterning. Just like stories purport to encapsulate and enlighten lived life, people's temporal trajectories and interactions, and history and anthropology and geology and sociology purport to exemplify and analyze the past, mathematical scientific knowledge purports to model the real world, the world of stuff, and the interactions of what makes up the real world. Max Tegmark goes as far as propositioning that mathematics is the world. And many see simulating the universe as the same thing as creating or recreating the universe. In truth, the classical model has been the only game in town until recently. The assumption that the world is profoundly patterned by mathematical relationships that are explicated more and more accurately by the many and varied fields of mathematics is now so deeply entrained by our culturally elaborated thinking apparatuses, in my view, as to be invisible. Scientists and mathematical wizards became the secular equivalent of the saints of old a couple of centuries ago. They are the new mouthpieces of God, delivering and interpreting the word. But something new has arisen. And because it arises from the old models, we assume it has all the characteristics of the old models, but it is radically different if understood in its essence. We didn't really notice, but if it wanted to catch the real world, classical computing started in exactly the wrong place. It had to be Bayesian, stupid. It had to be Bayesian. We haven't really noticed, but the recent success of convolutional neural nets becoming super expert chess and Go players and being used for more and more areas of expertise upset all and everything we know and have studied over the last 400 years, he says. This may sound somewhat hyperbolic, but stay with me. This will be the somewhat simplified but shocking core of the truth we've stumbled upon very recently. Let's begin, shall we? The games of Go in the East and chess in the West, played expertly, have been seen as very complex human intelligent behaviors. Both games appear to involve large dollops of logic, pattern recognition, strategic planning, and learning from expert games of genius exemplars of the craft. And since many saw computers as electronic brains, brainiacs, or thinking machines, it seemed proper and fit to try and make a really, really good chess program. Computer hardware was becoming pretty powerful, and programmers were also growing more confident, deploying new algorithms, using new languages, applying math and modeling in ever more powerful new ways. At first, programmers working with expert players, gamers, deployed what I have above called the classical or Turing, Van Neumann, Shannon computing paradigm. Extraordinarily fast, dedicated processors helped a lot. Large databases, structured programming, look-ahead algorithms, etc. And they employ them with good success. When I use the term Turing, Van Neumann, Shannon computing paradigm, I refer to the everyday and usual model of computing programming that ruled the waves in those days, was, for all practical purposes, the only game in town. It had been developing alongside the explosive growth of hardware for 50 years. It is mathematics at its deepest core. In a very, very small nutshell, it seeks to model the world somewhat like an equation models a parabola, or more complexly, a tensor field, via mathematics. Pretty quickly, chess playing programs got better, beating most players, but not yet the best. But they were working hard, these programmers. On February 10th, 1996, IBM's Big Blue computer finally decisively beat Garry Kasparov, the greatest of the great, the Muhammad Ali of the chess world. The world was shocked. Quite a feat. But the brouhaha was somewhat muted. People opined, groused, that parts of the initial programs were specially designed and tweaked by smart chess players and smart programmers, running special chess smart algorithms on very fast machines that could look ahead many moves, look ahead an inhuman number of moves. It was considered a brilliant technical feat, while being disparaged by some as brute force and narrow, kind of applying a human splinter skill. It wasn't the way us humans really thought, so maybe it was cool, but didn't threaten our core self-image. Our brains are, after all, fabulous universal computers, if not perfect at every computation. Those who worried about human exceptionalism disparaged away, and it wasn't seen to apply much to larger issues of the nature of cerebral activities or stickler issues, like how words, concepts, categories, memories might even theoretically instantiate in neural tissue. At the same time, in illo tempore, in those days, experts opined that the game of Go seemed different, a less likely victim of big computing for various reasons. The possible move space, a 19 by 19 board, seemed more infinite than chess, an 8 by 8 board. And genius moves of the best players seemed to be imagining or intuiting the subtlest of patterns from the beginning, almost from the very first move. Intuition was archetypally human, and some thought almost unprogrammable. Human intuition could almost magically fabricate patterns out of the ether. Machines were rigid and unconscious compared to us. But while Big Blue ran its victory laps, something different was happening in computing. There was a new kid on the block, just beginning to flex muscles he didn't know he had. After a good start, but the doldrums for 20 or 30 years, neural nets just then were racking up impressive accomplishments in language translation, visual object recognition, intelligent search, spoken language recognition, and many other fields. Was a revolution waiting to happen? Was the standard model of computing, classical computing a la Turing, Van Neumann, Shannon, approaching things from the wrong end, from the top down, instead of from the bottom up? It had to be Bayesian, stupid. Bayesian at the core means that patterns appear from the bottom up. From experience of many situations, something perfects the experiencer or perfects in the experiencer. You don't analyze and then algorithmize mathematical models to produce congruent models. You let experience, lots of data, lots of runs, change a substrate differentially to get the right answer. Instead of trying to engineer expertise and human applicable discernment into mathematical programs that mimic human abilities, perhaps we should let the machines learn more like the human brain does. Learn by practicing things over and over. Learn directly from behavior in the human world. Learn by adjusting the reactivity of individual synapses, which in a computer are mathematical nodes that we try to make mimic neurons or how neurons work. Individual synapses connected together in ingenious ways that respond better and better over time. After all, the environment, in its myriad guises and dimensions, the world, modifies neural tissue without any previously engineered or downloaded program, without any structured programming or high-level algorithms that we can think of. Let's give it a try. In 2016 and after, Alphabet, the huge parent company of Google, developed a series of more and more successful Go-playing neural net programs that quickly gained ascendancy. There were various iterations, but the last one is the one that is mundane to what we're talking about. AlphaMu, the program, was only programmed to play by the rules of Go, and later chess and shogi too. It wasn't introduced to databases of greatest games, or given hand-tweaked genius subroutines of search or analysis, or fantastic, inhumanly fast, look-ahead capabilities. It would simply learn from the world, learn from the process of Go. It was set up from the beginning to play thousands or millions of games against itself. Not against good players, then great players, to steal their expertise, learn how they were doing things, mimic and plagiarize their techniques. The program played itself. That's it. If it played better, the synapses, nodes of a mathematical neural net simulator, adjusted themselves. At first, its play was klutzy, worse than human amateurs, but soon it became competent, then very good, then expert, and then super expert. Super expert so much that in 3 days and many thousands of self-played games, it became completely unbeatable. I want to oversimplify everything for just a minute to get to the core of what we're alleging here. Without getting mired in detail, what is of profound interest is that a neural network that essentially differentially adjusts valences or mathematically represented sensitivities of layered nodes through repeated encounters with patterning actualities, having a better outcome in the game played, becomes able over many, many runs, and without representation or human structured ways of handling input, to mimic a very complex human, a very complex intellectual behavior. A bit of an aside. Historically, there have been myriad conflicting theories about how the brain worked, how humans learned from experience from the world. But deep down, we've always presumed that part of the process happens by modifying the valences, differential reactivity of the synapses, which certainly appeared to as a web or a net of interrelated nodes in the brain. The general intuition and supposition was why neural nets were invented in the first place. Kind of modeled on the brain, but much simpler, much simpler. Let big data, or many examples of what we're looking at, many wins for the computer, affect the neuronal connections. Then a pattern formed by the synapses will allow the program to triumph. So with alpha mu, we have a neural net that the environment influences. The machine plays the game against itself and either wins or loses. The environment influences by modifying the valences of assigned sensitivity of nodes, which leads to the modified, mutated, differentially adjusted net becoming able to mediate a behavior that in humans evinces remarkable intelligence. In only a few days of self-play, the patterns of the node valences somehow incarnate a pattern that, turned into game-playing behavior, becomes the best in the world. Not just mimics very good play, but surpasses the functioning of the best humans on the planet. The best computer programs today are unbeatable by our best players. In chess, shogi, go, and almost any other game we assign them, players use AI to practice and get better at competition with humans, but no longer aspire to beat the machines. When the machine produces a better outcome, comes closer and closer to winning, the nodes of the so-called hidden layers of the net are differentially adjusted to reflect this outcome. The world out there, the successful outcome over time, gradually reflects itself over time over more and more successful outcomes in the adjusted nodes. And eventually the neural net performs what was considered a very high-level human behavior almost flawlessly by human standards. Let's think about this in various ways. An expert human Go player or chess player learns a game, engages in many competitions, thinks about many subtle aspects of his or her endeavor, uses tools, books, expert opinions, historical database records, computers, etc., and finally becomes able to engage in a behavior that culture shows to have intelligence and expert pattern recognition ability at a level superior to what most average people can ever expect to achieve. And I'm sure along the way, he or she thinks, plans, strategizes, shares with other experts, etc., etc. But the expert's behavior, game playing, soon becomes inferior to alpha mu. And obviously, the program doesn't think, plan, strategize, share, examine databases of the greatest games. It simply wins. It behaves or reacts without awareness or words or plans. There aren't Turing Van Neumann Shannon programs being imagined and debugged and compiled. Experts don't analyze and deconstruct the behavior, playing the game of Go, implement algorithms and subroutines. We don't try and model the world and then tweak the models to make them better. We've, scientist types anyway, presumed and have been looking into how, at the synaptic level, at the node and net level, neural tissue is modified to hold memories and recognize match patterns and structures that might eventuate complex behaviors. In some ways, we've been looking for how thoughts might instantiate in the six-layered cerebrum, or in the connectome, or in some pattern of connections. Admittedly, at times it feels incommensurate. It's the hard problem of consciousness. It's hard to even imagine how electrochemical impulses model the world. We try, but it's hard to imagine how electrochemical or some sort of fleshly neural patterning holds or mirrors thoughts and abstract somethings that make us think. Our hope has been that all the fabulous and ever more sensitive brain machines, CAT scans, PET scans, fMRIs, etc., will someday elucidate how the brain works, how the brain thinks. In the light of neural nets and alpha mu, we might have found what we've been looking for, and found that in the deepest way we can imagine, it doesn't matter, because that's not how the world gets into our brains. You don't need to instantiate. You don't need abstraction or ratiocination. You don't need to know how to do in order to do very intelligent things. The reader, the listener, will draw parallels with many themes and sub-themes in this book relating to the body-brain computing without awareness. The thoughts about how to win and the thoughts that go along with accompany a win don't matter. We do it. We humans think. Experts do it. But that's just the human way. Alpha mu doesn't do it. Alpha mu doesn't have thoughts or thought structures or look ahead or intuitive strategies. It's interesting to think about what alpha mu's neural net patterns are and where they exist and in what time they exist. Though what this series of ideas shows is that it not only doesn't matter, but that there is no such pattern that relates from the synaptic node sphere to the macrosphere of human action. Work on that one among yourselves. Let me repeat myself. Behavior repeating itself in the human sphere, playing a game according to rules, becomes an input, and in turn, the neural net differentially conforms the loadings, valences, reactivities of complexly attached nodes. Eventually, the behavior resulting from the now conformed valences becomes capable of discriminating further input that it expertly parses as to effectively outperform human intelligences. There is no pattern in hundreds of thousands or millions of changed valences that relates the input domain to the game played expertly. And there are no strategies or expert thinking or look ahead or memory skills. Over many runs, games won and lost. And over time, the system enables expert behavior in the games of chess, Go, Shogi, etc. There is no real understandable connection between the end behavior and the valences. And I propose that the patterns of valences cannot be interpreted to give any significant insight into how the program could possibly win. You cannot, like you might do to a Turing van Neumann Shannon program, analyze and backwards engineer the behavior from the pattern of valences. You cannot even in principle relate the differentiated valences to the macro behavior of playing well. A bit of an aside, it's not at all unusual anymore for programmers or coders to not have any idea how a neural net program is doing what it's doing. And neural nets can find abstractions that don't relate to human abstractions in any meaningful way, and find patterns that would take humans centuries to find by trial and error. And we're just beginning this journey, as we all know. And another mind-bending implication relates to the fact that different nets of different configurations and sizes might achieve the same super expert competences and behaviors, but do so in patterns of weightings that are individual, unique, and non-standard, and maybe non-repeatable. Although human brains have great similarities of overall connectedness, in profound ways, each and every brain and brain pattern is unique. And parts of the brain that perform specific tasks, outputtings, are quite changeable, even moving around. How does this happen? Computers don't swap modules and patterns of processing at all. That would be catastrophic. Many years ago, Gerald Edelman, as I've said before, pointed out what he calls degeneracy of neural systems. That is, different complexes of modules and groups of cells and varied neuronal patterns can have identical outputs. Work on that one among yourselves. For a neural net, all knowledge is incarnated after extensive training, millions and billions of inputs in the valences of the nodes, and nowhere else. The past has imprinted itself onto the neural nodes, but it is not present in those nodes. And the presumed patterns of the world outside have nothing to do with the differential patterns of the nodes themselves anymore. The interactions differentiated the nodes, but no longer are relevant to the nodes. They don't relate. They exist in different time zones. And the patterns that the nodes relate to, parse and predict and recognize are in the various realms of man. And lately, non-thinking programs have been becoming expert in hearing, seeing, categorizing, relating patterns together in a myriads of fashions, and finding patterns that we scarcely imagined existed a few decades ago. I hope you're ahead of me in this. Let's think about these things. Brain tissue in itself doesn't think. Electrochemical signals, a true myriad of interactivities from inside and outside the body. Electrochemical signals trigger synapses, which very complexly are changed, to differentially react. The original and actual neural net, the 6-layered cerebral cortex, plus the nuclei, plus the differentially wired modules, etc., is conformed to the world and by the world. Probably more messily than our silicon nets, because it was never a sparse, abstract, one-dimensioned, one-applicationed self-creation. The world, the many dimensions of the world, incarnates in the differentially valenced organic nodes, the synapses. And what this process begets is differential behavior modified and expertly adapted by and to the world itself. What the valence modifications to alpha mu beget is differentiated behavior modified by the patterns of the game of Go. What the valence modifications to the brain beget is differentiated behavior modified by patterns, experiences in the many echo niches the body finds itself in, modified by patterns of experience in the world. When we talk about differential behavior related to the human organism, we include complex homeostatic adjustments, temperature, breathing, blood pressure, etc. Differential organismic cadencing of all kinds of signals, CNS, cerebellar, integrations of muscle responses, attentional eye tracking, entrainments, motor speech cadencing, etc. Learned discriminations of every variety, object permanency, category discrimination, object token verbal attachments, etc. And finally, the up until recently shadowy realm of language generation and use, resulting in culture. And absolutely, mind-bogglingly, gobsmackedly, all these behaviors, the generation of all the genius competences of all species, don't require that patterns, schemata, engrams, motor patterns, language traces, or even grandmother cells be somehow represented in neural tissue. The environment including, very importantly, the associative tissue of the cerebrum and the reentrant connectome, differentiates the synaptic net from pre-birth to death, resulting in all the competences evinced by all species endowed with neural tissue. This view is both constructively and destructively revolutionary. We learn to see the world. Analogously, we build up complex spatial, environmental, object data structures. We learn to see the world and differentiate things in the world. Stable object recognition, concept separation, verbal tokening, and relate things together logically as a clan. Syntax, semantics, cultural memes, conditioning, etc. We talk a mile a minute, discuss, analyze, make stories. We try and catch truth and the nature of the world in concepts and abstraction, which, like a Go player's study, analysis and experience against opponents, are concomitants to the process, not the core. The view developed here goes deep. It doesn't deny that there are domains that legitimately are explored via abstraction and differentiated by words and concepts. But it posits that these things, words, concepts, and qualia of every sort, are not things in themselves, but in effect, epiphenomena, an emergent layer, if you will, but unrelated to the deepest reality of neural synaptic differentiation. In effect, they, concepts, meanings, words, syntax, and semantics, and phonologies, plus all the other behaviors the brain-body environment generate, are equivalent to different aspects of the patterns organic neural nets instantiate in neural flesh. The complex environments the animal or human being inhabits cause excitations in neural tissue nets that, through repetition, potentiate the nets to respond more and more expertly to patterns immanent in the environmental signaling. That's it. That's all of it. And all the machines we've developed to pinpoint artifacts in the brain that relate to the world outside our skulls, and all the theories of memory and neural processing and the encoding of human intelligence and thinking using, using an information processing model, and just about all classical word-based theorizing are, ta-dum, drum roll please, are false. If you cannot, even in principle, find synaptic valence patterns that match a real world pattern, the whole enterprise of neurology may be compromised. This way of interpreting the world has consequences. I'll rattle off a few obvious ones. Correlating neural electrical energy metabolism with high-level behavior and other human actions seeks to identify a kind of correlate that does not exist. It's like trying to correlate winning at Go with the structure or shape or type of connectedness of groups of neural net nodes. They are incommensurate. They are not commensurate. It's certainly true that there is modularization and areas specific to certain aspects of perception. The visual pathways are real, but neural nets don't contain atomic-like analogs to things we speak about. Certainly do not contain cell assemblies or schemata that might instantiate analogs of existence and their relationships. Synaptic loadings are, in a way of speaking, a pattern, but this may render the world they represent and are reactive to unknowable. You cannot examine or understand the patterns of the alpha mu neural net nodes in order to understand what it is doing or how it operates, not even in principle. This may well mean that the relationship between the brain and what we perceive and think of the world is effectively that of a black box. We perceive behavior and expertise behavior of so many kinds. This behavior is instantiated in neural net balancings. The past impinged, but is not impinging now, so the connection may be effectively erased. We may not be able to recognize the congruences between the behavior and the brain patterns. In my books and other writings, I explore the relationship of knowledge and knowledges to words, meanings, and thinking. What we've been exploring here, how nodes incarnate patterns in differential valences, changes how we see the mind for the individual and changes radically the interpretation of culture and language. Thoughts are heard in the mind language. We are only conscious of phonology that allow us to be conscious of what our brain, our neural nets, are parsing and planning. Both language and culture are externalizations of the unconscious computation the individual humans and the species linked brains are performing unceasingly. But language and culture are themselves artifacts of the deepest level of the world's self-elaboration. Lastly, we always need to remind ourselves that the individual neuron or net of neurons doesn't think or plan or compute. Absolutely analogous to the fact that the individual neural node has neither purpose nor knowledge awareness of the whole. But the individual neuron or net of neurons has a life purpose of its own. The individual neuron has a life purpose of its own. Each cell works in its own nexus to feed itself and thrive. They thrive in connection and many, many kinds of interaction without purpose. And much of what they, neurons, do may have nothing to do with anything we can describe in words. The six-layered cerebrum and the myriad connections of the neurons of the nervous system are reactive tissue that are conformed by all the echo niches Homo sapiens inhabits and produce indecipherable patterns that in turn behave in the same environments. This view may make the information processing models of thinking and being in the world irrelevant and simply the misapplication of metaphorical concepts. A further addendum, an addition, a speculative continuation, an obvious absurdity. Evolution and insights from neural nets. Evolution and insights from neural nets. I think, like for most fairly literate readers of science, the past 50 or so years evolutionary doctrine has been both awe-inspiring, to say the least, and somewhat incomplete. The general ideas about how genes are passed down and affect genotype and phenotype are easy to understand as generalities. Ditto for overall ideas and theories about embryology and fetal tissue development. Although, in my opinion anyways, as soon as you begin reading detailed descriptions of the latest developments describing the almost insane complexity of relating genetic expressions, proteins, protein cell environment synergies, physical chemical gradients, topological determinism of cell differentiation, etc., etc. It all quickly becomes almost more than awe-inspiring. It becomes almost insanely convoluted and complex to try and decipher. And it quickly invites humility as to what we actually know and what is apparently a knotty, K-N-O-T-T-Y, mystery. My opinion, as a non-expert. I'd like to make a few provocative analogies as to what was opined in this weighty tome about neural nets and relate those analogies to evolutionary biology and embryological growth and differentiation. Remember, from way back, the fetus in the womb is differentiating flesh. The tiny, well-organized container and recipient and expressor of 1.5 billion years of life adaptations. 83 million years of mammalian evolution, 53 million years of primate adaptations, and more than 2 million years of humanoid adaptations. Biochemical, structural, species adaptive, genotypic, and phenotypic conformations. It brings nothing with it, owns nothing, except highly differentiated cytoplasm and its organelles and its genetic material. Its genetic material is not a thought pattern or a template or a blueprint, but a complexity of molecules interacting with a very tiny but already phenomenally intricate environment. The fertilized cell, the cytoplasm organelles plus the dynamic DNA molecules in their milieu, is biologically patterned matter that has incarnated 1.5 billion years of molecular conformations. As with neural networks, past influences created the present environmental molecular patterns. But the past is no longer present, no longer even relevant. The past influences are in complex biochemical interactivities that developed over million-year cycles, biochemical and biomolecular machines, Golgi apparatuses, etc., topologically differentiated physical, chemical, precisely cadenced energy transferences, etc., etc. The etceteras are near infinite because the differentiating cells of the fetus are inside an amniotic sac attached to a placenta, inside a uterus, inside a mother, inside an environment, inside a neighborhood. And I'd say controversially that there is also a species of holographic interactivity involved that is devilishly hard to tease out, profoundly subtle, near impossible to see, put one's finger on. A bit of an aside. Terms describing holographic processes themselves are ill-defined, slippery, I admit, and the field has scarcely been looked at. But partly because we don't naturally grok this kind of complexity. Our minds work easily with serial and sequential steps, not complex interferences. But holographic interference patterns in cell processes may be as nearly determining as atomic, molecular, gradient-dependent, etc. processes. Interference patterns are not electromagnetic interferences, although they can be, but both temporal and spatial wave-like pattern interferences in process elaborations and process outcomes. Long ago, modifications to environments, molecular reactivities, interactivities, cadenced series of cycles, unique molecular and enzymatic machinery, etc., depend on both extraordinarily complex physics and chemistry, but also upon myriad topological temporal interactivities that are inherent in the functioning of existent organisms. And these interactivities create the fetus ex nihilo. And if any of these organic interactivities is askew or amiss or mistimed in the slightest, the developing animal fetus dies or is rendered incompetent in one or another human econiche. A question arises for me anyways, and that question is it even theoretically possible to meaningfully describe this process? It's always possible to cogitate a short story about anything in our environment, a shorthand, linear word encapsulation. like the stories we tell to ourselves about ourselves. The trick is not to believe that the story captures the reality of what's out there. If the conformations are millions of years ago established interlocking patterns of spatial, temporal, molecular interactions inside larger and larger circles of influence, themselves interlocking patterns of spatial, temporal, molecular, and mechanical interactions, how can all this be disentangled? And if the Turing, Van Neumann, Shannon classical computing paradigm is another name for abstract modeling using mathematical analogs, the tools may be incommensurate with the task they are being asked to accomplish. Thinking about neural nets, we explored how a repeating macro-environmental phenomenon, behavior in cultural contexts that has a better outcome, can eventually incarnate or differentially alter synaptic reactivities to allow a macroorganism to act or behave in ways better suited to its macro environment. Behave in better ways to win at Go. Behave in better ways to successfully recognize complex oral wave fronts, spoken words. Behave in better ways by differentiating visual objects. All these behaviors become helpful coping behaviors when organic neural nets node loadings are modified accordingly. Past experience becomes encoded, if this word even applies, in a pattern of selectively modified nodes. Yet the experiences that induce the modifications in the nodes are no longer present or relevant. The analogy I'm making is that biological history, evolutionary biological history, shares some very powerful relationships with aspects of the neural nets we described in the previous sections. The standard and rather simple view of early evolution is that the complex environments of 1.5 billion years ago probabilistically, unthinkingly, produced complex molecules that survived and reproduced. The absolute core of the process is macro environments giving rise to complexes of molecules that became more able. The world, an environment, in a manner of speaking, acts on molecules. Somewhat like the environment of the game of Go acts on the neural nodes, differentiates them. Some molecules become more stable. They survive. They survive because they have been conformed over time to fit the environment better. This is not a value judgment better. It's built into the environment itself. In man-made neural nets, the ones we use are starkly simplified mathematical simulations, we know. In man-made neural nets, a quite finite number of nodes attached to levels interact complexly by modifying systems of nodes differentially, depending on outcomes. Evolutionarily, complexes of genes, promoters, and inhibitors, differentially producing proteins, but also complexes of RNA molecular promoters, inhibitors, plus complexes of many other sorts, are the nodes that are influenced, modified, valenced. The valencing is multidimensional. Spatial conformations, molecular reactivities, topological placement, temporal cadencing, etc. Jumping ahead, an amoeba-like early cell-like creature, greatly more complex than early stable molecular stage, is in a macro environment. The many successful accommodations its primitive, by our modern viewpoint, biology has achieved are due to 500 million years of the macro environment mindlessly conforming its molecules. Yet, like for neural nets, the past has no relationship to the present competences. The past macro environment is most probably no longer existent and may well be toxic to the little amoeba-like organism. The competences have become inherent in the topological, temporal, dynamic, and other relationships many molecules have with each other. Fast forwarding 1 billion or so years, we examine the human fetus. Myriad upon myriad past macro environments conformed organic beings of every imaginable form, biologically, typologically. And these conformations were multidimensional. Larger patterns, macro environments, engendered molecular and other conformations towards success. Success only means survival or perduring. The conformation resulted from space and time influences, interactions that no longer influence or can no longer possibly interact. This is precisely analogous to what we described about neural nets. The original macro environment, winning at Go for neural nets, eventually incarnates differential patterns in nodes to eventuate expert level play. But what and where is the pattern? The pattern of neural valence is in the present, and is not logically commensurate with what produced the pattern over time. The patterns of topological, temporal, molecular, and many other process variables that produce the human fetus are in the germ cells. The patterns are not intellectual, conceptual, mathematical. They are near ineffable and subtle molecular balances inherited from the 1.5 billion years of history that are no longer operative or retrievable. When we study or model or analyze, atomize the processes of embryological development, these are Turing von Neumann Shannon abstract encapsulations of the process, the analyzings. It may be that we can never comprehend the nature of the biological process because the origin of reason for the change is irretrievable. What happens here, analogous to what we saw for neural nets, is that there is a barrier of sorts, a fundamental loss of information or knowability that results from the nature of the process. The influence of the past is obviously the core of survivability. But because that influence is near infinitely complexly incarnated in the world, knowledge about the past is almost, by definition, irretrievable. Another important implication of this way of seeing things. On a certain level, examining the nature of how neural nets relate to the games of chess and Go, we found that the human way of playing was accompanied by many other behaviors that historically have been seen to be inextricably related to the game and expert game behavior. An expert human Go player or chess player thinks about many subtle aspects of his or her endeavor, uses tools, books, expert opinions, etc., to analyze large and small aspects of his and her behavior. Contrary-wise, Alpha Mu doesn't think or talk or analyze. Concepts needn't apply. It's not Turing von Neumann Shannon-esque. The chasm between abstraction and conceptualizing the world and being in the world deepens inexorably. An aside, anyone who has been awed and somewhat bewildered by Michael Gazzanaga's explication of his split brain research showing the left language word hemisphere needing to make stories up for what it cannot understand may be amazed at the parallel with what is being applied here. That's another half book right there. Summary. There are a few bookloads of implications that come with the ideas we've explored in this way of grogging the world. I've presented only a couple of obvious ones. In truth, this way of seeing neural nets and the Bayesian, non-Turing von Neumann Shannon encapsulation of reality is completely revolutionary.